This young black mother was abused by the cops, who believed that no one would notice. However, what followed was just unthinkable. Standing in the middle of the busy park event, Sarah was surrounded by a kaleidoscope of color. Music, laughing, and the aroma of several street cuisines filled the air. Her three youngsters, full of energy and curiosity, were like lively spirits darting through the crowd. Weeks had passed since they begged her to take them to the festival. Making wonderful experiences for her boys was something Sarah firmly believed in. Because of her particular familial status, she was accustomed to being excluded and subjected to bigotry in public. So her hesitancy was simply cautious. For Sarah and the rest of her family, her boys were no more than the following generation. To put it simply, Sarah loved all three of them. As was to be expected, she was fiercely protective of them. Sarah's biological sons, Malik and Marcus, were the source of endless vitality. Everywhere they walked in the park, people noticed and smiled as their laughing reverberated. Because she educated them, they became buddies. They didn't care or worry about individual distinctions. Her adoptive kid, Jeremy, was the youngest and quite different from his brothers. Jeremy was more of a reserved individual, lacking the overwhelming self-assurance they exuded. Although he made sure to constantly remain one step behind his brothers, he enjoyed spending time with them. His eyes were wide with awe, and his emotions were tinged with a little fear. He also made an effort to remain with his mother whenever he could, so he felt he was always protected. He prioritized safety and security because he was raised in a foster family. He might have appeared afraid to others, but Sarah knew her kid. There was a change in the air among the happy mayhem. The uncommon sight of a young black woman with two black sons and a white youngster drew tremendous glances, accompanied by whispers and pointed fingers. Although it seemed unavoidable, Sarah constantly made an effort to avoid this bias. Such looks, the quiet scrutiny that questioned Sarah's duty as a mother and her right to love and care for children of different races, were nothing new to her. She found it difficult to comprehend why she was often the object of criticism. White individuals are frequently seen adopting black children on TV and social media just because she provided a secure home for a little kid. When a black mother does the same thing for a white child, it is viewed as some sort of monstrosity, yet no one ever seemed to mind there. She was pretty pissed off by that, but she was generally able to keep her cool. However, when a worried white woman went up to the festival's police officers, the whispers took on a malicious tone. Sarah could see two blonde-haired Caucasian women pointing toward her and conversing animatedly. She realized it didn't imply anything positive for her, even if she didn't know what they were saying. The strain in her body gradually increased as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. In silence, she awaited the outcome of their talk. With an anxious tone, the taller of the two ladies pointed to Sarah and said, "There, officer, that woman with the white child." Sarah watched as the cops turned to face her and examined her from head to toe. It was clear to her right away that they would not become her pals. Prejudice and assault served as the police's compass as they gradually started towards Sarah. She could tell they were serious by the way they walked and the emotions on their faces, but she had no idea what they were about to do. She held them to a higher standard than ordinary prejudiced individuals because they were law enforcement personnel. Sarah called for Malik and Marcus to return to her as they drew nearer, drawing Jeremy closer to her body. The pit in her gut warned her that things would not go well, but she had no idea what was about to happen. They halted when they were 10 meters away from her. Looking down at her condescendingly, the taller policeman dropped his spectacles a little. In a suspicious tone, one officer said bluntly, "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions about the boy." "What about him?" Sarah curtly said, her patience worn thin by experience with such unjustified scrutiny. This did not sit well with the officer. He moved forward with his hand on his belt and resumed his queries, looking bloated and irritated by her response. "To whom belongs the child?" What's he doing with you here? Sarah was not pleased about this. Why did they instantly fall back on her being a criminal again? Jeremy is my adopted son, she said quietly after taking a long breath. Here, everything is good. If you want proof, I can provide it. The cops rejected her explanation, and her statements were met with skepticism. They simply did not understand why a black mother would be there for a young white son.
She was sickened by their lack of vision. Why was she always being watched? She was angry about it. Sarah became frustrated as the disagreement turned into a furious altercation. Something terrible happened as she grabbed for her phone to contact her husband. The cops came up behind her and said they were going to take her down to the station on suspicion of abduction before she could call his phone. For Sarah, this was the first time. It was the worst treatment she had ever received. Abduction? This was going too far, and she was afraid she wouldn't be able to turn back. She could feel the panic building inside her as they cuffed her firmly, disregarding her cries and her boys' confused looks. Their expressions were filled with terror, which she could see. The thought of them seeing their mother's detention made her feel nauseous. The person most impacted was Jeremy. He started to tremble and froze in place. He could not handle this. When Sarah saw this, she demanded that Marcus console him and instructed them to contact their father right away. She continued to object to the arrest. She had no fear of creating a stir or attracting notice. She wasn't guilty. When the truth was out, everybody who hadn't considered offering assistance would feel terrible. "Leave me alone. My boys, Jeremy, please." In the middle of the frantic celebration, she let out a desperate cry as they pulled her away, leaving her boys dumbfounded and afraid. Other than reminding her of her Miranda rights, the police hardly spoke to her. She was violently pushed into the patrol car and driven directly to the station. She made it plain the whole time that she was not accompanying them voluntarily. Sarah's face was covered in deep shadows from the bright fluorescent lights of the questioning room at the police station. After giving her some time to process her rage, they barraged her with accusations about how she got Jeremy. She made a valiant effort to remain composed and concentrate on the current circumstance, but her thoughts were racing with concerns for her sons. She found it quite difficult to understand the violence aimed at her. She was aware of the suffering and abandonment that Jeremy had experienced before to being a member of their family. The idea of his revisiting the nightmare in this hostile setting was too much for her to handle. She was concerned about the safety of her boys and where they were at the station. Naturally, how would they treat her boys if they were treating her this way? The mere thought of it made her feel nauseous. The lads were in their own questioning room, so she had every reason to be worried. The guys clung to one another in silence while the cops tried to interview them because they were so terrified and confused. For them, the police were now signs of danger rather than safety. Jeremy continued to weep. The boys jointly resisted the cops' attempts to remove him from his brothers so they could interview him. They were going to make sure they stayed together since their mother had urged them to. Marcus continued begging for his father even though he knew they couldn't speak to them without an adult present. The cops were baffled by this. If they attempted to interrogate the youngsters without a guardian present, they would be infringing on their rights. They hoped the kids wouldn't inquire because they were too afraid. They attempted to ask Sarah more questions concerning her family life, but she was finished responding. Given how awful they had been to her, why did she feel the need to comply? They didn't want to trust her, even after she had made an effort to be truthful and respond to their inquiries. Thus, her only option was to wait for her attorney. When she had the opportunity to defend herself, she was becoming excited at the prospect of the punishment she would face. However, she remained solitary in a frigid cage, longing for her boys. Hours went by like eternity, every minute a torture of fear and uncertainty. Sarah logically understood that she would have to wait for either her lawyer or her husband. The first person to reach her would be able to save her and the boys from this terrible predicament. It would take a while for her husband to get there because he was on a business trip and was many hours away. Regarding her attorney, she suspected that he was being held up by the police. She suppressed the feeling of hopelessness that kept rising. All she had to do was remain optimistic. Then all of a sudden, the police were arguing with someone at the room's door. They were barely out of sight, but Sarah strained to see who it was. Then she heard the voices of her boys. This gave her hope. Something was obviously going on, but what? The door was flung open just when the tension became overwhelming. Someone she knew all too well stood in the light like an angel, someone who added a completely different perspective to the issue. The woman's name was Michelle. She was the social worker who initially assisted Sarah in adopting Jeremy. It was such a relief to see her. She was aware that she was the one who could correct the record. When Michelle saw Sarah in her current state, she looked appalled. She quickly started criticizing the cops for how they handled Sarah after turning on them. The cops' preconceptions were quickly dispelled when Sarah's earlier statements that Jeremy was her adoptive son were confirmed. Michelle even went so far as to claim that the cops intentionally discriminated against Sarah. She promptly summoned the station's head police officer. To see him, she pulled Sarah with her. Sarah noticed her 3 boys cautiously waiting close by as she left the room. They rushed over to their mother as soon as they spotted her and gave her a tight hug. They had been really concerned for her. The small group then proceeded to the chief's office. Michelle took the lead, griping about the circumstances and the terrible treatment Sarah had received. When you have doubts about custody, is it customary to treat someone in this manner? Why was Sarah treated so horribly by your officer? Is it because Jeremy is white and she is black? The top police officer, of course, was appalled to learn that such abuse had been occurring at his station. Without delay, he summoned the concerned policemen and asked them what they had done. The cops were obviously overcome with sorrow as soon as they entered their superior's office. With a hint of guilt and regret, the apologies came pouring out. Their comments were accepted by Sarah, who was emotionally and physically spent, but the wounds from the experience were still there, engraved in her spirit. Even though she was exhausted, she was resolved to speak out when she felt up to it. Her boys were her first priority right now. She gave her sons an even tighter hug now that the formalities were done. As she checked in with young Jeremy, she dropped on her knees. He was grinning, but tears were welling up in his eyes. All he wanted was for his mother to return. The most important thing to him was her. Sarah was just a mother with a young kid to look after, and that was precisely what the bigoted, obnoxious individuals who had first targeted her had overlooked. Their skin tone was only a physical characteristic that had no bearing on anything. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and resentment as she left the station. The event, which started off as a celebration, had become a sobering reminder of the biases that still exist in society and a clear indication of the difficulties that families like hers confront. But there was a glimmer of hope in her heart, a hope that a seed of change could sprout from her tenacity and the suffering she has experienced. A society in which preconceived notions and discrimination would no longer split families apart and where unjustified judgments would not destroy innocence. There was no doubt that she would utilize her experience to spread awareness of the atrocities committed against others by the same people who were supposed to be protecting them. What a terrible tale. If this were to happen to you, how would you feel? Do you believe that the police and women had good reason to be wary of her? In your opinion, how ought they to have addressed the matter? Please share your opinions in the comment section below. Thank you for viewing. Till the next occasion.